Beacon Press Audio presents Prisons Make Us Safer and 20 Other Myths About Mass Incarceration by Victoria Law. This audiobook is narrated by Melissa Moran. Published by Beacon Press Audio, 2021. A note on language. I frequently use the term jails and prisons when describing the incarceration of people who have lost their liberty. However, jails and prisons serve two different purposes in the criminal court system. Jails are used to detain people while they are awaiting trial. They are also used for people sentenced to less than 12, or in some states, 18 months behind bars. Prisons are used to incarcerate people who have been convicted or pleaded guilty and who have been sentenced to more than 1 year behind bars. The term criminal justice system refers to the legal system in which people are arrested, prosecuted, and threatened with imprisonment. Advocates, particularly abolitionists, are increasingly rejecting the use of that term, noting that the system does not provide justice. It metes out punishment. They often use the terms criminal legal system or criminal punishment system instead. In most instances, I've chosen to use the term criminal legal rather than the less accurate but more widely used criminal justice to describe the system. I keep the term criminal justice reform to indicate the discussions and promises made by politicians and political candidates. Throughout this book, I have avoided using the terms that are often used to describe people who are incarcerated: inmates, prisoners, convicts, and felons, unless I'm referring to a historical term, such as county convict. Eddie Ellis, a former Black Panther who spent 23 years in prison and then founded the Center for New Leadership on Urban Solutions, pointed out that these terms are devoid of humanness, which identify us as things rather than as people. I've eschewed these terms in an effort to emphasize that no matter why someone is incarcerated, each of the 2.3 million people behind bars are, first and foremost, human beings. Introduction. The United States incarcerates significantly more of its residents than any other nation. Though it has only 5% of the world's population, with 2.2 million people in jails and prisons, it has nearly 25% of the world's prisoners. As shocking as it is, for years society remained largely silent about the massive increases of people being locked away and about the abhorrent conditions inside jails and prisons. That's beginning to change. In recent years, mass incarceration has become a frequent topic of news headlines, political debates, and even pop culture. Bolstered by shows like Orange is the New Black, documentaries like Ava DuVernay's 13th and When They See Us, Bryan Stevenson's memoir-turned-biopic Just Mercy, and Michelle Alexander's bestseller The New Jim Crow, prison issues are no longer relegated to the political sidelines. The prison population hasn't always been so massive. In 1980, the United States held 501,886 people behind bars. But a combination of tough-on-crime policies and the public's demand for longer and harsher punishments increased the number of people behind bars by a whopping 500% over the past 40 years to today's 2.2 million incarcerated people. If you add in the number of people on probation or parole, that number rises to nearly 7 million, from 1.84 million in 1980. For women, those numbers rose even more dramatically. Between 1980 and 2014, the number of women behind bars increased 800%, from 26,378 to 215,332. This increase, as distressing as it is, does not include the additional 1 million women on probation or parole, nor does it include the unknown number of trans women held in men's jails and prisons. As of 2018, 698 of every 100,000 people are behind bars in the United States. This explosion is what's become known as mass incarceration. Still, what do we need to know when we talk about mass incarceration? Who does it affect and how? How exactly did we get to this point? And how can we reverse it? Despite the heightened attention to mass incarceration in the last decade, many myths persist, often justifying an expansion of the same policies that caused the explosive growth in the first place. For instance, there's the long-standing myth that jails and prisons are necessary to keep people safe from high rates of crime. But violent crime has actually dropped 51% over the past 25 years. The persistence of this myth justifies the continuation of policies and the introduction of new laws that tear individuals from their homes, families, and communities, causing incalculable harm. Another commonly held myth, which contradicts the previous one, is that most people in prisons, particularly in women's prisons, are convicted of non-violent drug offenses. This myth focuses attention on only one aspect of the problem or on one segment of the prison population. Such a narrow focus, to the exclusion of other factors, often leads to proposed solutions that may improve conditions for some, but often make them worse for others. This book is divided into 4 parts reflecting the larger questions around mass incarceration. Each part addresses one common misconception using facts, figures, and stories from people who have been directly affected. Part 1 examines and debunks several persistent myths about the causes behind the prison boom, including the myth that private prison corporations drive mass incarceration. This myth, popular among college students working to divest their schools' holdings from private prison corporations, became a talking point among presidential hopefuls during the 2019 Democratic primary debates, with politicians blaming private prison corporations and promising to curb, if not terminate, their contracts. But this myth conveniently ignores the fact that private prisons hold less than 10% of the prison population. In fact, not only does focusing solely on private prisons ignore the underlying causes of mass incarceration, but it often results in shifting people from private to government-run facilities where conditions are just as atrocious and life-threatening. Part 2 addresses myths that justify incarcerating people in need of social services, such as those with mental illnesses or substance addictions. These myths posit that jails and prisons are providing needed services, such as mental health care and other assistance, which would be unavailable to people otherwise. By positioning incarceration as a means of gaining access to needed services, this myth diverts attention from the lack of funding for similar resources outside of jails and prisons. Part 3 dives deeper to not only debunk myths, but also highlight issues that are often overlooked and invisible in larger discussions. These chapters are intended to introduce these issues to readers who are new to issues of incarceration, and also to challenge more informed readers to think more deeply and broadly about who is in prison. I include chapters that focus on the invisibility of women and trans people, who are often excluded from the larger and purportedly gender-neutral discussions about mass incarceration. Their concerns, priorities, and even existence are often forgotten in conversations and writings about mass incarceration, frequently leading to reforms that leave them behind. Even in chapters that do not focus on gender and gender identity, many of the stories highlight women caught in the criminal legal system. The majority of people in U.S. jails, prisons, and immigrant detention centers are men. However, incarcerated women experience all of the same banalities and brutalities as their male counterparts. At the same time, their gender and gender identity adds additional layers of injustice and violence inflicted upon them by the prison system. Centering women's stories and experiences allows for a more expansive discussion on the ways in which mass incarceration destroys individual lives as well as families and communities. Another chapter focuses on immigrant detention. Technically considered a civil rather than criminal commitment, immigrant detention has frequently been omitted from discussions about mass incarceration, even though detention conditions mimic the worst horrors and abuses inside jails and prisons. Even before the nation's prison population began to skyrocket, people, and some government bodies, began to call for an end to incarceration. Some even called for prison abolition, the idea of ending not only prisons, but also radically changing societal structures and conditions in order to render imprisonment obsolete. The idea of abolition, once viewed largely as a fringe idea, is now gaining more attention and momentum as more people attempt to examine and address the issue of mass incarceration. 1 week after I turned in edits for this book, Minneapolis police murdered George Floyd, a 58-year-old black man. His murder sparked weeks of protests in all 50 U.S. states and internationally. Accompanying these protests were demands to defund and dismantle the police altogether. Abolition has gone from a radical concept often dismissed as pie in the sky by policymakers and the general public to the starting point in an increasing number of public debates and policy discussions in cities across the U.S. Part 4 addresses myths.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?